it takes place in this neighborhood. And I'm just really glad to be here. It's spent a lot of time in Minneapolis, and this book came out a year ago when I wasn't able to do any readings or anything like that. So this is the first time I will be presenting this book in public to anybody. So I hope it works. I'll warn you that in order to read this chapter, we're going to have to repeat a terrible word, but it's the only way to be historically accurate. I sang a lot of Come All You songs, Bob Dylan said in 2015 in his Music Cares address, a speech to a foundation supporting musicians, telling the tale in that 45-minute talk of his whole musical life. There's plenty of those Come All You songs. There's way too many to be counted. Come along, boys, and listen to my tale, tell you of my troubles on the old Chisholm Trail. Or come on, all ye good people, listen while I tell the fate of Floyd Collins, a lad we all knew well. And he goes on. Come all ye fair and tender ladies, take warning how you court your men. They're like a star on a summer morning. They first appear, and then they're gone again. And then there's this one. Gather round, people, a story I will tell about pretty boy Floyd, the outlaw, Oklahoma, knew him well. If you sung all these Come All Ye songs all the time like I did, you'd be writing, come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, except that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. I just love the idea of Bob Dylan standing up there quoting his own song. If your time to you is worth saving, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. The times they are a-changing. You'd have written that too. There's nothing secret about it. You just do it subliminally and unconsciously because that's enough. That's all you know. And then he says sort of mysteriously, that was all that was dear to me. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway. Don't block up the hall, for he who gets hurt will be he who has stalled. The battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing. As with Blown in the Wind, the year before, in 1964, this song seemed obvious. Obvious who was who, what was up and what was down, who was trying to make history, and who was trying to stop it. The song was so programmatic it could have been written by a committee. The Come All Ye tradition tipped right over into the finger-pointing tradition, the right side calling out the wrong side in a big righteous march to shout down the walls of Jericho. I used to care, but things have changed. You could have heard Bob Dylan sing in Curtis Hanson's film Wonder Boys in the year 2000. He started with lines from the old folk song Worried Man Blues. The lead instrument was a stick on a snare drum, keeping an unchanging beat. The tone of the singing was so full of dissonance and irony and amusement over the singer's own hobbled stance in particular and the foibles of mankind in general that, don't get up, gentlemen, I'm only passing through, felt far more alive, more dramatic than the line, all the truth in the world adds up to one big lie. I used to care, the song went. It wasn't a personal statement, Bob Dylan telling you where he himself stood now. It was something far more political. more a matter of one person seeing himself in others. Regardless of where any song begins, whether in private sentiment or public catastrophe, if it achieves any shape at all, it ceases to be what the person putatively in charge thought it was when he or she first turned on the light. It becomes a fiction. Somebody trying on the role of someone who didn't care, to see where it would take him, what words it would turn up, what rhythm the story needed to come across, what it would tell him about a world where, as a presidential election played out, maybe nobody did care. It could leave the listener wondering if the whole thing wasn't one big joke, a feint, someone slipping the left hook history throws at anyone almost 60 who thinks he has something to prove, who thinks he knows how the world works. Things Have Changed won an Oscar, which over the next year Dylan displayed on top of an amplifier. And the more you listened, the more questions turned around. Things have changed? Do you care? Did you ever? If Mr. Voice of a Generation, Mr. Jesus is Coming, Mr. Wiggle Wiggle said he didn't care, was there any reason to believe him? Did he ever care or not? Who cares what Bob Dylan thinks? But the smile under the words as he sang them never dimmed. Whoever was singing this song was having a very good time. The times they are a-changin', things have changed. That's how history is made or dissolved. When you step back and say nothing really ever happened and nothing ever will, everything about the times they are a-changin' felt obvious. Nothing in Things Have Changed did. The whole song turned on the line, most easy to miss and buried in the music, in the middle of a verse. Just for a second, I thought I saw something move. Just for a second, I thought I felt history take a step, which means that history is real, that I'm part of it, that I can't escape it, that I don't want to escape it. It was a trick of the light. The song kept up its relentless pace, standing still in 4/4 time. On January 6, 2021, the times they are a-changin' didn't seem obvious, and history exposed how vulnerable the song really was. The people flooding through the Capitol, smearing feces on the marble, hoisting Confederate flags, as John Calhoun and Charles Sumner looked down from the walls, smashing into the Senate chamber, beating police to the ground, and kicking them where they lay. They weren't chanting, "Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call, don't stand in the doorways, don't block up the hall," but they could have been singing those words. Instead, they sang the old folk song, Old Dan Tucker, which there's almost a whole chapter about in this book. Instead, they sang Old Dan Tucker, shouting, "Get out of the way, you fucking nigger," at black Capitol policemen. They're saying, one of them said, "Trump is our rightful president. Nobody voted for Biden." That was Capitol Officer Harry Dunn. I needed to catch my breath, so I said, "I voted for Biden. What, my vote doesn't count?" And a woman responded, "This nigger voted for Joe Biden." And everybody there started joining in. "Hey, nigger!" It was over 20 people who said it. 2 months later, I walked into NC, a now closed coffee shop on Washington Avenue. On the wall over the turntable behind the counter, what you saw when you ordered was a display of LP jackets, Billy Joel's The Stranger, Willie Nelson's For the Good Times, Joni Mitchell's For the Roses, Elton John's Greatest Hits, and The Times They Are A-Changin'. And all but the last looked dull, like cheap advertising with whatever aura of art, of success they might have carried long ago, now corroded. But the squinting face and the stark posture of the person on the Dylan album still communicated an undimmed questioning. It held its moment. But even more than that, it made its own moment. It tossed its past into the present. It retained the power to put you on the spot. There were many better songs on the album than the title song. Ballad of Hollis Brown, With God on Our Side, North Country Blues, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll most of all. But it was the old war horse, the old protest song, the old catchphrase, merely a relic. It was a relic, like the sign that not long after the album cover display went up in NC, just as the murder trial for Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd the year before was about to begin in Minneapolis. The sign that began to appear here and there in the uptown district of the city, a neighborhood of small shops and a few restaurants and coffee houses and bars, slightly bohemian around the edges, a sign unfolding as part of a mural on the siding of a shut-down movie theater uptown, just down the street, where the mural read, "The times they are a-changin'." It was there for months. I don't know who put it there. I don't know what it meant. And then there was behind the Ace Hardware store, on the street behind it, in a warehouse that was all bricked up, there was another mural on the siding of, behind it was big, it was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. And the top half was made of broad, vertical, blurred rectangles, the half images piled on top of each other, looking like a field of raised arms, and creeping up from the bottom, fading out halfway, in red worked into the brown, were dozens of carefully drawn symbols, most in their own boxes, like the tiny hieroglyphs in a Chuck Close painting, triangles, empty squares, diagonal scores, crescents, and the longer you look, some tended toward abstractions of specific things, the American flag, a mugshot, a megaphone, and in the upper middle on each side of a divide made by a raised concrete strip on the building with florid white commercial stenciling inside 2 deep circles, someone was playing that NC album again, the odd capitalization signaling that the artist was the author of the words as much as anyone. Don't, in capitalize, criticize what you can't understand on the left, for the times they are a-changin' on the right. It was like the painting the Los Angeles artist Henry Taylor made in 2017 on the shooting death the year before of Philando Castile. You remember that, in the St. Paul suburb of Falcon Heights, just miles from where the uptown murals went up 5 years later. Castile was driving with his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, in the front, and her 4-year-old daughter, Deanna, in the back. And he was stopped by Officer Geronimo Yanez because, Yanez said later, Castile looked like a robbery suspect because of his broad nose. Castile, although he told Castile it was because of a broken taillight, Castile informed Yanez that he was carrying a legally permitted handgun. Yanez shot him 5 times as Reynolds used Facebook to live stream Castile's body slumped in his seat. Henry Taylor began with frames from Diamond Reynolds' shaking video footage, and the image he made too was slightly off kilter, and it showed a white hand pointing a gun through a car window as a black man lay dead in his seat without the huge red spread of blood on his stomach in Reynolds' film, without her in the seat next to him, without her daughter, a man alone with his left eye open and fixed, and the painting was the same size as the stencil in Minneapolis, 6 by 8 feet, a virtual mural of his own, and the picture exploded with color. The police officer's black uniform, his white arm, the car's green interior, Castile's blue seatbelt, white t-shirt, brown skin, the dark ceiling of the car, the yellow-orange of the street filling the car windows, what might be a glimpse of blue sky and a white cloud. It was overwhelmingly still. It was imagined. It was a fact. Hieronima Yanez was charged with murder and acquitted. The title of the painting was "The Times They Ain't A-Changin' Fast Enough." So that's one short chapter out of the 7 chapters in this book. Some are very, very long. A couple are very, very short. And now we can talk.
Thank you, Greil. I've been reading your work since I was a teenager, and one of its pleasures, I think, is how you're able to contextualize a piece of music or work of art historically in its time and then see how we change and it changes through history. And so thanks for sharing that example of that art here. A week ago I finished a biography. I'll just plug Magers Quinn. I was able to order it from here and it came as quickly as Amazon would have delivered it. It's Aidan Levy's recent biography of Sonny Rollins. And the timing was kind of apt because I was thinking about our discussion and their careers run in parallel to some degree. They both took extended and productive breaks really at the height of their status as spirits of the age, and they are both revered for being protean figures. Their voices and their language is always in motion. Sonny Rollins' tenor sax, the tone of it changes, and also his harmonic vocabulary. And likewise with Dylan, his language, his literary art, his lyrics can be clotted and modernistic and elusive, or they can be folkloric and plain spoken. And likewise, his voice can be, it always is changing. Its timbre, its register, its accent, and its regionalisms, where it comes from his body, can be chesty and incisive and gravelly, or it can be heady and flute-like and thinner. And I guess for me as a listener, this has less to do with the sort of postmodern project of destabilizing the continuity itself, which is also interesting, but maybe more to do with his gift as a theatrical performer. I always feel like he is looking at a song or a body of songs and imagining who should be singing this song and how would that singer sound and how can I find the voice of that singer within myself. And I think that dovetails with this beautiful idea you have in this book, which is that the engine of Dylan's songs is empathy. And you touched on that in this chapter when you wrote about the vantage of the song. Things have changed. It's not him speaking. It's an act of characterization and imagination. So maybe you could elaborate on that idea and sort of what it encompasses for you.
Well, Bob Dylan had a press conference in Rome about 20 years ago, and at one point he said, you know, people are saying, what are your songs about? And how do you write songs? Where do they come from? What's this all about? And he said, I can see myself in others. And he said similar things over the years in different contexts about different people, but that's, you know, that just really struck me. I can see myself in others. I look at other people and I wonder, if I were that person, what would I do? What would I be thinking? How would I feel about myself? Would I be afraid? Would I be full of confidence? And those other people, I see myself in others. That, you know, that can be someone you see on the street, somebody you know, a historical figure, a fictional character. Early in his career, in about 1961, when he's, you know, 20 years old and he's in Greenwich Village in New York, he's hanging out with other folk singers, and he says to one person, you know, I'm writing a song about Emmett Till. Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi in 1955, but in 1961 that was still a crime that was, you know, present. And it's probably more present today than it has been for the last 40 or 50 years for many, many reasons that we could go into. But here he is in 1961, he's 20 years old, and he says, I'm writing a song about Emmett Till as if I'm him. Can you imagine the chutzpah, the nerve, the arrogance of a 20-year-old white kid in New York City saying, I'm Emmett Till. I'm going to write a song in Emmett Till's voice. I'm going to tell you what it's like to be lynched, or God knows what. He never wrote the song, or at least if he did, none of us will ever hear it. What a remarkable thing to say. What an ambitious thing to say. To imagine yourself as Emmett Till at 20 years old. Well, he, you know, maybe he couldn't do it, couldn't pull it off. Okay. But that became the starting point for this book. Looking at a certain number of songs, a small number of songs, and taking the characters in those songs as real people, and then listening to the way Dylan sang himself into their lives. Whether they were characters he created out of whole cloth, whether, as I said, whether they were, you know, people out of the news, historical figures, fictional characters, but always saying, if I were him, if I were her, what would I be doing in this situation? How would I sound? Who would I want to talk to? Who would I want to speak to? Who would I want to hear me? Understand me? And to me, that sense of empathy, as I found it, going through songs from the beginning of his career to the present, that did sound like the engine of those songs, the motor of those songs. What gets them started? What keeps them running?
All music, of course, interprets and reimagines the music that precedes it, but in folk music, in one sense of folk music, the interpretive art and the idea of building new structures on existing foundations can be defining. So I wanted to ask you about a few songs that you write about in this book that Dylan did not compose. First, I wanted to ask you about No More Auction Block, which is a spiritual, it's a song about slavery and its end. It's a song of mourning and a song of liberation. I first heard that song on this beautiful record by Odetta from 1960 at Carnegie Hall, and I know Dylan was admiring of Odetta as well. I didn't make the connection between those two songs until I heard Bob Dylan's version of No More Auction Block from the Gaslight Cafe. It was recorded in October of '62,
Right.
after he had recorded Blowin' in the Wind, and it was first issued commercially on the first edition of the bootleg series. I don't think it's too mystical to say that even if you didn't know those origins, this song, No More Auction Block, is present in Blowin' in the Wind, not only for the musical and harmonic ideas that it provided, but also for as a kind of ethical foundation. Can you talk about sort of how he made use of that material and sort of how it survives in the song or doesn't? Or
Yeah, I think you've already laid it out in a very sophisticated and complete way. Dylan never hid the fact that he took the melody of Blowin' in the Wind from No More Auction Block, and in fact from the version that Odetta sang on this very album, which is overwhelming, overpowering. No more auction block, no more auction block for me. No more pint of salt, no more driver's lash, no more auction block for me. And some people say that the origin of the story is it was made up and it was first sung by escaped slaves in Canada. Others say that it was sung by black soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War. Neither, of course, cancels out the other. But it was a song that was there, it was around, and it traveled, and it lasted. Odetta, didn't make it up. Paul Robeson sang it, he didn't make it up. It was passed on, it was heritage, it was legacy. But as Dylan said, as Dylan Hicks said, as Dylan Hicks said, Bob Dylan didn't just take the melody. It was, as your words, the ethical foundation. He's singing a song, Blowin' in the Wind. It's about mountains, and it's about the sea, and it's about a dove, there's absolutely nothing in it about slavery or the civil rights movement or racism or exclusion or discrimination, and yet everybody who heard that song when it came out in 1963 knew that's exactly what it was about. It was unmistakable. He was able to put these metaphors together in a way that, without ever mentioning anything specific, everybody understood what he was talking about. Maybe in a way that was, as I was saying before, just too obvious, just too easy to understand that song. And yet, when Bob Dylan himself gets up in the Gaslight Cafe in 1962, when he's 21 years old, and he sings No More Auction Block, and he's, you have to inhabit a slave, a former slave. No more auction block for me. I've escaped that. It's not going to happen to me anymore. But it did happen to me. And I lived that life. And he's going to get up there and pretend, look at me, I'm a slave. Look at me, I used to be a slave. You start the song out that way, you're not going to get an inch into the audience. He simply picks up his guitar and he starts strumming it. And the strum is ghostly, it's unearthly, it doesn't sound like a guitar, it doesn't sound like it came from any particular person. It sounds like it is just this disturbance in the atmosphere that has been brought down into this little club. And then he starts singing really slowly, but it's that hum that is persistent, that carries through the entire performance. And I think, there he is looking at the song. He is, again, diving in to a character that isn't him, that couldn't be farther from him. And he pulls it off. And he's absolutely convincing. You don't think, white kid from Minnesota, as Malcolm X in a great play described him. This white kid from Minnesota, talking about Blowin' in the Wind, he's talking to Sam Cooke in this play, and he's saying, How come this white kid from Minnesota is singing about our people and our struggle, and you're not? And Malcolm X is pointing his finger at Sam Cooke. It's so wonderful. Anyway, One Night in Miami. Wonderful play, wonderful movie. Bob Dylan dives in, he becomes that character, he pulls it off. He says, if I were that ex-slave now singing this song, how would I sing it? What would come out of me? What would I want people to hear?
Another song you write about, and this is one of the longer chapters, another song to which we can't ascribe authorship, is an Australian folk song called Jim Jones. This is one that I was introduced to by Bob Dylan. It's on the first of 2 records he made in the early 90s, solo acoustic records of traditional material as well as blues favorites that were written by writer-performers. And he also performs it quite extensively during that period, and you kind of track the peaks and valleys of those performances through live recordings. But you also use that song as a springboard to talk about the folk revival and the milieu from which Dylan emerges. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about revisiting those performances and sort of where that song led you in writing this book.
Sure. That's it's a very long chapter. It's the longest chapter in the book, except I guess for the chapter on Blowing in the Wind. It's about 70 pages. I always loved this old folk song. And it's one of those come all ye songs, come all ye friends and listen to my song and I'll tell you the tale of what I done wrong. And it goes on like that. It has many verses. Has a lovely up and down melody that just carries you forward. And it's about somebody convicted of a crime in England and put on a prisoner ship and sent to Australia, which was essentially a penal colony in the late 18th and in the 1700s and 1800s. And he goes, on a ship across the ocean. They're attacked by pirates. He gets to Botany Bay and suffers and swears vengeance, swears death on all the people who sent him there, his guards, the people who sailed the ship, the judge who sentenced him. He's going to somehow escape and kill them all. And that became an opening into a story of during the folk revival, or as one folk singer liked to call it, the folk scare of the late 50s and early 60s. Who could really do what Bob Dylan did with these songs, inhabit them, give them new life, bring them to a different life than they ever had, act them out in a way that was convincing in a manner that was scary and transporting. Who could do that and who couldn't? It seemed to me there were just a very, very few people who were able to do that. And this gave me a chance to talk about them, talk about what they were able to do, what Dylan was able to do at the same time with the same kind of material, and why other people couldn't. Including some extraordinarily noble people. Some, like Mike Seeger, the singer and band leader, that Dylan looked up to as if he were a kind of saint, as if he had a knowledge, a talent, an ability, and just a place in the world beyond anything he could ever really aspire to. And why he ended up a deeper singer, a deeper musician, than Mike Seeger was ever able to be throughout his long and noble career. So I talked about Bob Dylan, I talked about the British singer Anne Briggs, I talked about the Oklahoma folk singer Karen Dalton, talked about Joan Baez, and talked about Bob Dylan. But again, the question began in the second half of that long chapter. Bob Dylan is singing the song. How is he singing it? How is he interrogating it? How is he asking in the song, how should I sing you? What's this about? Well, a friend of mine happened to send me probably 20 years ago, 25 years ago. He sent me 3 CDs of every live performance Bob Dylan did of this old folk song, Jim Jones, in the year 1993. He performed it 32 times in that year. It's not known that he ever performed it before, and he's never performed it again. But in that year, he couldn't stay away from it. And it just so happened, I listened to that set of 3 CDs over the years, probably, half a dozen times. I just throw them on. I'd listen to all of them, all the way through, 32 songs in a row, and it became utterly fascinating to see when he was able to get near the song and then fall short, when it's just a complete botch, when something amazing happens and it's as if he reaches for it and it's not there anymore. He can't get it. And then once or twice, it all comes into focus. And then on the last night of his tour of that year, it's in December, the last time he will ever play that song, as if he knows he'll never play it again. It's just this absolute breakout rock and roll shout. We're done with that, No more meaning, no more acting, no more investigations. Who cares? Make noise. And so I followed those performances. I tried to.
A publication.
That is my watch telling me there's something the matter with me. This is my diagnostic watch. I turn off my phone, but I can't turn off the watch.
Yeah. So there's a publication that came out of the folk scare rather, and was based right here in Minneapolis. And you read about it a bit, and you also quote from it, and that's the Little Sandy Review. And I was the passages you quote are still so vibrant. Can you talk a bit about what it was like to revisit? Not sure if you had access to that publication in the 60s or if this was all new to you? Or
No, I found out when I started doing research for this book, which just meant reading around and listening and thinking and bumping into things. I always knew about the Little Sandy Review, this folk music publication that was put out by 2 University of Minnesota students starting in early 1960. Their names were John Pancake, who is still here, and Paul Nelson, who died in 2006. And their goal was to put out a little magazine where they would say what they thought about folk music. They were madly in love with folk music, with the old field recordings from the 20s and 30s that had been collected that were very, very difficult to find. And with all the new folk singers that since the Kingston Trio in 1958 with Tom Dooley were coming out of the woodwork everywhere. And all the people singing old traditional songs, whether it was Pete Seeger or Harry Belafonte, Woody Guthrie, people who went back to the 40s, but now who were being listened to in a wider, broader mass cultural sense. And they wanted to say, here are the phonies, here's the real thing, here are the crimes against art, here are the people who are carrying the true torch. I mean, it was a sarcastic, hilarious, combative, purist little magazine. And I found out that unless I was able to sit down and read every damn 30 issues that came out over 5 years, that I just wouldn't understand the territory. It was really the map. And through some really great detective work, and thanks to some really great people, I was able to get a complete set, and I sat down and read every single one of every goddamn record review, and there were hundreds and hundreds. But you know, reports from a folk festival in Chicago that was absolutely, you know, just this great stand-up comedy routine, a whole issue on why protest songs were essentially a crime against nature, more than a crime against folk songs. Just, you know, a crime that would pollute anybody who got near it. They pulled no punches. In the second issue, I think there was a picture of John Pancake sitting at a typewriter, pounding away. You see him from behind, and over his head on the wall in front of him it says, "Give him hell." And that's really what it was like. And I'll show you. This is the kind of art that they would put on the cover. This is from 1961. You got JFK and Jackie, who they describe as the 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Ramblers. And one of their big songs is White House Blues, about the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. And you know, I mean, that was very funny in 1961 to say that. It isn't so funny when you pick up this issue now, many years later, and you realize John F. Kennedy is up there singing about the assassination of a president, and then he becomes the next president to be assassinated. Now that's a song, White House Blues, that Bob Dylan quotes from. The very first lines of that song are the very first lines of the second to last song on Rough and Rowdy Way, the song just before Murder Most Foul. The doctor said, "I can't find that ball," to McKinley. "I can't get the bullet out." McKinley squalled, McKinley moaned. The doctor said, "I can't find that ball." This was what the magazine looked like. This is how big it was. This is its size. And it might be 20 pages, it might be 60 pages, just as much as they could fill it. And throughout, and I think this was more John Pancake than Paul Nelson, who was a good friend of mine. Throughout, there was philosophy in here, really heartfelt philosophy about something that was disappearing from America. And when this music was gone, if it were ever to be lost, something of America would be lost with it, and something that would never be replaced. It would be lost forever. That's the sense that goes through this little magazine. And it's all through this book. It's really my conscience, or I tried to make it my conscience of this book.
There's also a eulogistic component to this book. Frequently, if you mention someone whose story overlaps with Dylan's story or this music, and they're deceased, you will mention the date of their death and how old they were then. It's kind of a leitmotif or a refrain, and it became for me very moving as the book progressed. Can you talk a bit about that decision and sort of what role that played for you?
You know, I guess it had something to do with being older myself. People, you know, you get to be my age, people start to die around you. Become very aware of that. But as I began to move through the book, I realized that I was writing about a lot of people who were friends of mine, who were part of this story, who were actors in this play. Paul Nelson, who I just mentioned, but Tony Glover, the Twin Cities musician, who was a good friend of mine.
And a contributor to Little Sandy Review, right?
And wrote record reviews as Dave Glover for the Little Sandy Review. and who was here at that time, Kerner, Ray, and Glover, the traditional folk group. That was one of the great bands to come out of Minnesota. John Cohen of the New Lost City Ramblers was a friend of mine. Mike Seeger, who Bob Dylan so idolized, was a friend of mine. I knew these people, and I wanted to honor them. And then, as I began to do that, I began to put people's birth years and death years in a little parenthesis after their name was mentioned, or maybe in a narrative way too. I thought everybody deserves that. Everybody who appears in this book, every real person who has died deserves that. I have to do that. Because, who knows? Maybe I'll be dead before I finish the book and someone will have to do that for me. You don't know. So that was it. It made me cry sometimes to do that, when I put those little parentheses in, because I miss these people.
I want to ask one more question before we open up to Q&A with the audience. One of the things that you do in your work, throughout your work, is you situate the reader as a listener, and you create this immersive experience that evokes a listening experience. I think because the description is very slow and detailed, but there's something about the combination of that description with describing what it felt like to hear this. And sometimes, sort of this, I guess, is sort of a rhetorical or a writerly question, but sometimes you'll do that autobiographically, like in your real life column, which is kind of diaristic. You will describe a situation you were in which you were confronted by the song. Sometimes you'll use the second person or some other kind of collective voice. What did it describe more? What did it feel like more generally to hear this song then, or did you hear a song later? Is that something that happens sort of improvisationally as you're writing, or do you kind of think about how you want to situate that writing in terms of person or vantage or perspective?
No, it really is just what feels right at the moment. When I'm trying to bring this song to life, I'm trying to make it, to give it historical presence, which doesn't mean fixing it in a specific moment in time, but giving it presence as history takes shape, as it changes shape, as it moves on, as it seems to come to a stop. It's just what feels right, what sounds right in the moment. It's not strategic.
Yeah. Let's try to get some questions here. I'm not sure if we'll have time for all of them, but...
If I could say, Dylan's 13 years older than me. I never really heard, I grew up here in Minneapolis, in Ridgefield. I never really heard him until I moved to London. And a guy, an Anglo-Indian guy who loved Mahalia Jackson, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Bob Dylan, introduced me to Bob Dylan in Chiswick. And since then, I've been listening to him ceaselessly. Initially, he struck me as being so cool that I couldn't access him. I loved what he was saying, but it took me a while to understand what you're talking about, which is that empathy that he has with other people. And it reminded me a lot over the years of another great artist, James Joyce, who he name checks in another song, who is known for his pyrotechnics of literature, but to me is great because of his love of humanity, his expression of the mundane and the value of that. And I think Dylan has a knack for doing that as well. He protects himself with his cool, but he is able to operate, as you bring out in your book, through that sense of empathy.
Well, being cool can be really vicious. It can be all about putting other people down, showing them they're not as cool as you are. And the folk singer Bob Newirth and Bob Dylan used to hang out at a bar in Greenwich Village called the Kettle of Fish, and it was right upstairs from the Gaslight Cafe that we were talking about, where Dylan would play in the early 60s. And they'd hang out at the bar, and people would, come up to them, maybe people they knew, maybe people who had heard about them, and they'd say, hey Bob, did you see that? Have you heard that? And Bob Newworth, another person who died, who I knew, Bob Newworth and Bob Dylan would put these people down so low that they not only went down into the club below the bar, they went down into the basement below the bar, halfway to China. And if you want to hear what that sounded like, what that felt like, just listen to Ballad of a Thin Man. You know, somebody comes up to Bob Dylan and says, Bob, this incredible movie, you ever see The Wild One? You ever see Marlon Brando? And it's like, yeah, something's happening in that movie, but you don't know what it is. Like that.
Well, Ratso Sloman covers that nicely in his book, On the Road with Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
talking about that scene, but he's got a nice mention of Dave Van Ronk, who was put down by those two guys at that scene, and his retort was, Bobby, you're so rich, how come you're not, what the hell did he say? How come you're not good? Something like that. You're so rich, how come you're not good?
I want to make sure we get a few other voices here before, that's fine, I love those great comments. Are there other people who want to, yes?
Any critical opinions on the Rolling Thunder Review documentary that Scorsese did?
Yeah, I loved it. This is a documentary about the Bob Dylan's 1974 Catch Can kind of minstrel show circus tour with all these different people involved, and a lot of fictional episodes, fictional characters talking as if they were part of this tour. They saw, they were in the audience, whatever it is. Hollywood actors, Sharon Stone, other people. I just thought it was just wonderful. I like to see other people play other people's songs. And to me, this is Martin Scorsese playing Bob Dylan songs. He can't sing, he can't play guitar, but he can make movies. Anyone else?
Were there any songs that almost made the book? Were there any chapters that you didn't include?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I've written a lot about Bob Dylan over the years. I wrote a whole book on Like a Rolling Stone. So I wasn't going to write about any songs that I'd already written a lot about. And these were songs that, for whatever reasons, I'd never really written about. When Ain't Talkin' came out on the Modern Times album in 2006, and it's the last song in the album, and it's really long, and it just goes on and on and on, and I remember when I first heard that song, I said to myself, I'm never going to get to the bottom of this song, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to. So with this book, I said, okay, I'm going to try now. I've tried many times before in class, in lectures and classes, and stray references. No, I'm going to get down and wrestle and see what I can do. And I didn't get all the way there, but that was just enormous fun, just a wonderful challenge. So that was a song I'd always wanted to write about and hadn't been able to. The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. Writing that came out of a trip I took with my family up the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, past Duluth, listening to songs, and the Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll came on in the car from a song list that had been made up, and I'd heard that song for 50 years, and God knows how many times. And it was like I'd never heard it before. I heard it as something absolutely new, and it shocked me, and it hurt, and I didn't know what to do. And so, okay, I have to write about that. I have to find a way to do that. But because I'd written so much about Bob Dylan in the past, it was easy to leave out a lot of things.
I think I saw Colleen raise your
Yeah.
hand. I think we might only have time for one more.
I so loved your chapter on Blowing in the Wind.
Thank you.
You can make a song feel like it's the Bible and, you know, full of weight and open to interpretation, which I just have always found so beautiful in your work. These short little music lyrics have such huge lives. On their own in some ways, but then also in our lives. And I love that you started out with the story of not liking the song, and then you take us through your differing and changing assessment of it. And I want to know the children's book that you wrote, the foreword or an afterword, because I think we all should have that book and be giving it out. I had the experience of being with this young woman who was super smart. She had been to a student at Oxford. We were at this kind of cafe, and there was a singer singing Blowing in the Wind. She also was the executive director of a foundation. So she had a lot of power. And she was young, she was probably about 30. And the singer started singing Blowing in the Wind. And I said, oh, I love this song. And she said, oh, what is it? And I was literally just shocked that she would not know Blowing in the Wind. So I think we need to be sharing that children's book and playing the song and keeping it going.
This is a book that was made up a number of years ago. An artist wanted to make a children's book about Blowing in the Wind. And so he would take the lyrics, you know, one line a page, maybe 2 lines on a page, and then he would illustrate it. He would draw something. And I was asked to write an afterword to that book. And I really, you know, up until that point, and it was not that many years ago, I never liked the song. It just seemed so obvious. It just seemed like one of those songs that was written by the Times. The Times wanted a song like this, so Bob Dylan pumped it out. The first time I ever heard it, I was with a close friend of mine who's still a close friend in 1963, and it was playing on the radio, and he said, kind of ersatz, you know, kind of secondhand, kind of received, kind of obvious. And I said, yeah, I know what you mean. So I was asked to write an afterword to this book. So I'm supposed to write something for 6 and 7-year-olds. How do you talk about this song to little kids? How do you bring them into it? How do you say, you know, why your parents or your aunt or whoever gave you this book? What are you supposed to do with it? And so in a very few words, I tried to open the song up. And in the course of doing it, the song opened itself up for me, and I heard it completely differently. I heard it as a miracle. And that, you know, maybe that's where this book began, but that, I was so shocked, you know, that after all these years, I could finally hear it.
If you want to really learn something, teach it to 10-year-olds.
Well, they weren't even 10.
What's
Thank
the name
you.
of the book?
What?
What's the name of the book or the author?
I forget the name of the author. I'll give you a copy, Colleen. I think I have an extra one at home. But it's called Blowing in the Wind.
I think we should conclude. There might be some time to talk informally after this event. I want to thank you all for coming, and Greil, thanks for asking me.
Thank you.